For over 100 years, historians believed escape was inevitable. From every plantation, from every system of bondage, someone always ran. Someone always tried. Except one. In the Louisiana parish records of 1847, buried between crop tallies and baptismal names, there is a line that should not exist. No recorded escape attempts. Ever. Not few. Not unsuccessful. None. The plantation was known as Bellmare, though locals refused to say the name aloud. It sat low in the marshland, where the Mississippi bled into rot and fog, and where sound traveled strangely, as if swallowed before it could echo. Bellmare operated for 86 years. Hundreds were enslaved there. Men, women, children, generations born and buried on the same soil. And no one ever tried to flee. That fact alone disturbed early archivists. But what followed disturbed them more. No punishment records, no patrol logs, no manhunts, no reward notices, and no letters from neighboring plantations warning of runaways. Bellmare existed in a silence that should have been impossible. In 1911, a junior clerk named Edgar H. Loomis made the mistake of asking why. He requested access to Bellmare's sealed correspondence, documents marked ecclesiastical, church-owned. That same week, Loomis resigned. 2 months later, he was found drowned in shallow water, less than 3 feet deep. The coroner ruled it an accident, but Loomis had written a letter first. It was never mailed. It was never archived. It was found tucked inside a hymn book at St. Corvin's Chapel, miles from Bellmare. The letter contained only one sentence. They did not stay because they were chained. They stayed because they were already gone. What Loomis saw in those records would not be discussed again for nearly 40 years. And when it was not discussed by historians. It was discussed by the church. Bellmare did not look like other plantations. Visitors remarked on this with unease. There were no iron collars, no visible shackles. Overseers carried ledgers instead of whips. Doors were rarely locked. This was presented as benevolence. The owner, Augustine Bell, was described as a devout man. He attended Mass daily. He funded seminaries. He spoke softly and rarely raised his voice. He claimed obedience came from order, not fear. And at first glance, it seemed to be true. Enslaved workers rose before dawn without being summoned. Children walked in straight lines without instruction. Meals were eaten in silence, not enforced, but absolute. Runaways were unnecessary, Bell said, because they are cared for. But visiting priests noticed something unsettling. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one cried out at night. Even newborns rarely screamed. One visiting deacon wrote that the plantation felt less like a labor camp and more like a cloister, as if the souls there had already taken vows they did not remember making. Sunday services were mandatory. Attendance was perfect, but the sermons were strange. They were not about salvation. They were not about heaven. They were about stillness, about surrendering the self, about becoming empty enough to be useful, about silence as holiness. The enslaved were taught hymns with altered verses, lyrics that did not exist in any Bible, words about forgetting one's name, about laying down memory as a sin. And slowly, over years, the people of Bellmare stopped speaking of escape, not because they feared punishment, but because the idea itself no longer formed. Birth records from Bellmare reveal another anomaly. Children born there did not behave like children elsewhere. They did not ask questions. No records exist of children asking where their parents came from. No inquiries about the world beyond the fields. No stories of curiosity, rebellion, or play. Teachers sent by the church wrote reports filled with unease. One wrote, "They learn letters quickly, but not words like why or elsewhere. They copy scripture perfectly but cannot explain what it means." Another noted that when shown drawings of rivers, forests, or roads, the children showed no recognition, no longing, as if those concepts had no weight. More disturbing were the confessions. Children as young as 7 were brought to confessionals, not to confess misbehavior, but to report thoughts. Thoughts of leaving. Thoughts of imagining life beyond Bellmare. Thoughts of dreaming while awake. These thoughts were treated as illness. And illness required correction. Correction did not involve pain. It involved isolation. Children who wandered in thought were taken to the lower rooms beneath the chapel, stone chambers originally built for prayer retreats. They returned quiet, focused, and changed. They no longer remembered what they had confessed. and they never confessed again. At the heart of Bellmare stood St. Corvin's Chapel. It predated the plantation itself. Local legend claimed it was built on the ruins of something older, something not meant for worship, but containment. The altar was made of dark stone, not native to Louisiana. Its surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Candles burned lower near it, as if starved. Beneath the chapel ran tunnels. Church records called them meditative passages. Former clergy used another word: descending corridors. It was here that the true function of Bellmare was hidden. The chapel did not teach obedience. It taught erasure. Weekly sermons instructed congregants to imagine placing their memories into God's hands, one by one. Names, faces, desires. Eventually, even fear was surrendered. What remained was compliance without resistance, peace without joy, life without direction. And when the mind finally emptied enough, escape no longer made sense. Because to escape, one must imagine somewhere else. And Bellmare made sure no one ever could. In 1938, during a routine diocesan relocation, a crate was discovered behind a false wall in St. Corvin's Chapel. Inside were ledgers unlike any plantation records ever seen. They did not track productivity. They did not list punishments. They did not record births or deaths. They tracked compliance of thought. Each enslaved person was assigned not just a name, but a state. Unsettled, diminishing, cleared, quieted. The final designation appeared beside most names. Hollowed. Next to it were dates. Some individuals reached this state within months. Others took years. But once marked, no further notes appeared, as if nothing else about them mattered. Marginalia in the ledger revealed something worse. Small crosses were drawn beside those who resisted the process. Next to those crosses appeared a phrase written in Latin: Ment solvitur. The mind is unbound. Church authorities claimed this referred to spiritual release. But medical historians recognized the symptoms described alongside it: loss of autobiographical memory, suppression of imagination, dissociation without trauma response. Not madness, empty obedience. Survivor testimonies from neighboring plantations often spoke of Bellmare with confusion. Runaways who reached the borderlands expected others to follow. They waited. No one ever did. One man, formerly enslaved on a nearby estate, recalled approaching Bellmare's edge and calling out at night. No response. He said it felt like shouting into a church after Mass had ended. They were there, he said, but nothing inside them was listening. Records show that Bellmare's overseers carried no weapons. Instead, they carried confession slips. Daily reflection was mandatory, not on sins of action, but sins of thought. To think of leaving was framed as pride. To imagine freedom was framed as rebellion against God's will. Those who confessed such thoughts were praised for honesty. Then taken below the chapel. Correction was not painful. It was thorough. Blueprints found in the chapel's archives revealed chambers never mentioned in public documents. They were not cells. They were listening rooms. Thick stone walls, narrow benches, low ceilings that forced occupants to bow their heads. Priests would speak softly for hours. Not sermons. Questions. Who are you? What do you remember? What do you want? And when answers came, they were gently dismantled. Memories were reframed as burdens. Desires as temptations. Identity as noise. Sessions ended only when the subject could no longer answer. When silence replaced self. Those who emerged did not look broken. They looked serene. And they never entered the lower rooms again. Bellmare was not isolated. A town existed less than 5 miles away. They traded with the plantation, worshipped with its clergy, sent their sick to its chapel for blessing. They noticed the silence. They noticed the lack of escapes. They noticed the way Bellmare's people walked, heads slightly bowed, steps synchronized, eyes unfocused. But they said nothing, because the church said Bellmare was a success, a model of order, and because, in quiet ways, Bellmare was used as a threat. If you cannot behave, parents told children, you'll end up like them. No one ever explained what that meant. Long before Augustine Bell acquired the land, the site was already marked. French colonial maps from the late 1700s labeled the area with a warning rather than a name. Terra du Silence, Land of Silence. Local indigenous accounts, translated decades later, spoke of a place where thoughts grew thin. Hunters avoided it. Elders warned that staying too long caused the forgetting of paths, even inside the mind. When missionaries arrived, they did not flee the land. They claimed it. Early correspondence between church officials reveals fascination, not fear. One letter, dated 1812, describes the site as an ideal environment for spiritual discipline, where the soul may be stripped of distraction with minimal resistance. This was not a plantation at first. It was an experiment. Hidden within church archives was a doctrine never taught publicly. It was known internally as sacred quies, sacred stillness. The belief was simple and dangerous, that human suffering was born not from oppression, but from desire. Erase desire, and suffering ends. Erase identity, and obedience becomes peace. Bellmare was chosen to test this belief on a population already denied autonomy, not to punish them, but to perfect control without violence. Priests stationed at Bellmare were not typical clergy. They were trained in rhetoric, memory theory, and early psychological methods decades before such fields were formally named. They studied how repetition reshaped thought, how silence erased self, how confession could be weaponized. Bellmare became the proof. In 1863, something unexpected happened. A woman named Eliza Gray remembered a dream. This alone was unusual. Dreaming had become rare at Bellmare. Most inhabitants reported blank sleep, rest without imagery. But Eliza described a river. She described movement. And she described standing on the opposite bank, unsure how she had crossed. She did not confess the dream. She kept it. And for the first time in decades, a Bellmare resident did something unprecedented. She hesitated. Just once. That hesitation was noticed. Eliza was taken to the lower rooms. But the process did not work. She answered questions slowly, carefully, as if protecting something inside her. Records note, subject exhibits resistance not through defiance, but retention. Retention was dangerous. Within weeks, others began reporting dreams. Not escape plans. Not rebellion. Just elsewhere. Priests panicked. Because sacred stillness depended on total internal containment. And containment was cracking. Eliza Gray never tried to escape. That terrified them more than if she had. Within months, others began reporting dreams. Not vivid, not detailed, but directional. Dreams where something was beyond. The church called it cognitive drift. A failure of containment. The lower rooms were used constantly. Confession schedules doubled. Silence was enforced more strictly. But something had shifted. Once a mind remembers that it can imagine elsewhere, erasure becomes harder. The plantation did not erupt in rebellion. It became uneasy. People paused mid-task. Children stared at the horizon. Hymns were sung with hesitation. The stillness was no longer complete. Modern readers often ask, why didn't they flee when control weakened? The documents answer clearly. They no longer understood how. Maps meant nothing. Roads had no meaning. Direction required memory, and memory had been systematically dismantled. Bellmare had not restrained bodies. It had untrained minds for movement. Freedom requires imagination. Bellmare erased it. Even those who dreamed could not translate longing into action. They felt loss without language. In 1871, a fire broke out in the eastern quarters. It should have been chaos. Instead, witnesses described calm evacuation. No screaming. No disorder. People walked out in lines. When asked later why no one used the opportunity to flee, one man replied, "Where would we go? There was nothing outside us." That statement was recorded, then buried. Sacred Quies was declared compromised. The experiment was over. Church officials ordered Bellmare to be closed, not exposed. Records were sealed. Clergy reassigned. The plantation dissolved quietly. No emancipation celebration. No reckoning. Just dispersal. The people of Bellmare were sent to other plantations, orphanages, and parishes. And something followed them. When Bellmare closed, church officials expected reintegration. They were wrong. Former residents placed on other plantations did not adjust. They followed rules perfectly, but failed to act without instruction. They did not flee when beaten. They did not rebel when separated. They did not protect themselves. Overseers complained. These ones break without breaking, one wrote. Orphanages reported children who stared for hours without speaking. Doctors had no diagnosis. Because what had been removed was not sanity. It was self-direction. In 1894, a priest named Father Henri Valois broke silence. He submitted a report condemning sacred quies. His conclusion was devastating. We have mistaken silence for holiness. We have mistaken obedience for peace. And we have mistaken emptiness for salvation. Within weeks, Valois was removed. His report disappeared, but not before a copy was hidden inside a hymn book, the same one Edgar Loomis would later find. Section 19. Why history erased Bellmare. Bellmare was not erased because it failed. It was erased because it worked. It proved control could exist without chains, without violence, without visible cruelty, that terrified institutions more than rebellion ever could. So Bellmare became a footnote, a missing name, a silence in records. The final entry in the Bellmare ledger is dated 1873. No names, just a sentence. They did not stay because they were enslaved. They stayed because they no longer remembered leaving. And beneath it, written in a different hand, God forgive us. We taught them how to disappear.